From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Another mass shooting has once again sparked a national debate on guns. Locally, a group of state lawmakers say they plan to introduce a bill banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines in Rhode Island. Both sides of the gun control debate on the first half of Newsmakers. Then, embattled State Senator Nick Kettle has resigned after his colleagues moved to expel him. Kettle spared the state Senate having to go through the expulsion process, which has never been used since it was created 175 years ago. The pros and consequences of trying to evict a lawmaker on the second half of Newsmakers. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining us on the second half, we'll have two executive directors from Common Cause Rhode Island, John Marion and Stephen Brown from the ACLU of Rhode Island. We'll be talking about State Senator Nick Kettle and the expulsion process. But first, joining me from WPRI.com, reporter Ted Nesi, and representing both sides of the gun control debate, we have Frank Sicoccio, president of the Rhode Island Second Amendment Coalition, and Linda Finn. She's president of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence. Frank and Linda, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Linda, let's dive right in. Lawmakers are set to introduce gun control bill next week. If passed, what would it do?
Well, it's an assault weapon ban. It's modeled after the federal ban that Dianne Feinstein's been trying to get passed on the federal level. What it basically will ban weapons of war that are what we've been calling assault rifles or sporting guns or whatever the verbiage is, and also high-capacity magazines over 10 rounds, which is similar to legislation that's been in place in Massachusetts since 1994 and similar to legislation that Connecticut has passed and New York has passed, California has passed. So it's a bill that we want to be in compliance with our neighbors so that we all have the same legislation.
Frank, I assume you oppose the bill. Tell us why.
We oppose the bill because what happened is the federal bill that they talked about, the assault weapons ban, it was in place for 10 years. It was allowed to go away by its sunset clause because they did two independent studies and it showed that there was almost no reduction in crime or in violence because of it. So now they're trying to introduce the same or similar style of legislation in Rhode Island. It doesn't seem to work. It has a history of not working. And in Connecticut, when they tried to pass when they did pass the same legislation, if you take a look at it and do some research on it, approximately 90% of the individuals in Connecticut that actually had these firearms refused to comply with it. And then some of the police departments were coming forward and police officers saying, we're not going to enforce the law. We're not going to go door to door. We're just not going to enforce the law.
Linda, he says it's ineffective.
Well, I think at this point, it's kind of a moot point as to whether it's effective or not effective. And, I think both sides of the issue can have their own statistics to prove either way. I think at this point, it's a matter of the people of Rhode Island, whether or not they want to ban them or not. I mean, the thing about these gun laws is that, our organization and the people that we work with, we all support the Second Amendment and know that people have a right to have a gun in their home and to protect themselves. But they don't have a right to own an assault weapon, and we as Rhode Islanders, we can decide whether we want to change that or not. And so I don't think it's a matter of statistics, or I think it's just a matter of people are just fed up with the guns and they just don't want them to be in people's hands.
Sorry to jeopardize it here, Ted, but just one more question for you, Frank. Let me ask you sort of the question that Linda raised there. You hear from a lot of people when this issue comes up, they understand the Second Amendment rights people have. They understand being able to own a handgun, and they understand being able to own a rifle, say, for hunting. But there are a lot of people that just cannot wrap their heads around why anyone should be able to purchase a weapon like an AR-15. What do you say to them?
Well, if you take a look at the actual numbers, it's approximately 300 million guns in the United States right now. And those firearms have been used, owned, and they don't cause any problems to anybody. So we're looking at individuals that own these firearms for hunting, for self-defense.
I think people would push back that they haven't caused any problems for people, but I probably didn't ask it well. What's the appeal of an AR-15?
It is the most popular rifle out there right now. It has all different applications with regard to sporting, with regard to home defense. It has ease of use. It is a very popular firearm right now.
Is it just fun? Is that the appeal to that weapon for people who are gun enthusiasts?
No, it's not just fun. It actually has applications for as far as sporting, as far as home defense. It is again, one of the most popular rifles right now.
Linda, I want to ask you, you even sort of alluded there to the fact, you said, you know, there can be statistics on both sides, whether it's effective or not is in some ways a moot point. Rhode Island already has some of the strictest gun laws in the United States. I believe it has one of the lowest rates of firearm deaths in the country. It seems like there may be an argument in some states where gun control activists would say there's more of a problem, but Rhode Island, it would seem, is one of the states that isn't suffering from a major gun violence problem. So why should this be high on the priority list when it would seem the statistics show this is a relatively safe place for firearms?
Sure, that's a great question. That's one of the good things about Rhode Island is we do have some strong laws. We have a 7-day waiting period. We do background checks. I mean, those are all really important measures to have in place. We also have a low gun ownership in Rhode Island. I mean, it's less than 20% of the population owns guns, which also contributes to having a low rate. But actually, in the last year or two, I believe it is, you know, our rate has gone up in comparison to, say, Massachusetts, and the rate of deaths have gone up, and so it's not. You know, we do have some good laws, which is great, but we do still need. There's still room to have some other, you know, stronger legislation as well.
Frank, the flip side for folks on your side of this argument would be then maybe the laws are too strict from your view. Maybe there's too many restrictions. What do you think? Are you going to advocate that Rhode Island lawmakers pull back on some of the rules that are currently in place, or do you think it's currently the right balance?
It appears to be the right balance because we have some of the strictest laws, you know, across the country on this. But focusing on the law that they're trying to pass right now, I don't think it will have a very measurable effect on reducing crime or violence on this. It has a history of not working. If we're going to go and we're going to take a look at the gun laws, we want to make sure that anything that we do actually has a real world effect and will actually try to save lives. This will not do that. We've seen it in Massachusetts and Connecticut. After passing those laws, gun violence didn't go down.
The president is looking to restrict anyone who is under the age of 21 from being able to purchase a gun, like an AR-15 down in Parkland, Florida. You know, that suspect was under the age of 21, so the president wants to raise that age. The NRA is opposed to that. Where do you stand?
Well, currently right now there's probably thousands of examples of people that have been 18, 19, 20 years old that have purchased rifles, that own them and used them responsibly, legally right now. So to raise it to 21, I'd like to see some statistics first to see if it would have a measurable effect on deterring either crime or violence on that. Because what it looks like right now in Rhode Island, that doesn't seem to have an effect. If we have a history of people in Rhode Island being able to buy rifles and use them for sporting, for hunting, or for other reasons, and there hasn't been a problem, why are we changing the law on that?
I know it doesn't go far enough for you, but this must be one of the few things you're in lockstep with the president on.
I think that it would certainly help, but in my opinion, you know, right now in Rhode Island, somebody can go and buy a gun that can shoot for close to 5 miles, that are used in military situations, and you know, these guns are dangerous, and you know, they're not for civilian use, and any of these AR-15s that are being purchased, they're not used for hunting, and I would push back on the idea that they're used for home defense. I mean, I think that just for somebody to have one of these weapons in their home and to think they're going to use it if there's an intruder and they have children in the next room, I mean, I just find that hard to believe that would be their first line of defense, would be an assault weapon. You
had an adverse reaction when she said 5 miles. Did you want to address that at all?
5 miles, I mean, most sniper rifles, a good sniper rifle will reach out to 800 to 1,000 yards. I don't know where she's getting 5 miles from.
Well, that's right? If you look at the Barrett 820i, I believe it is, you can just look it up online. I mean, they say that they can shoot up to 5 miles. They've been recorded as killing a sniper in 2002, used it and was recorded as killing at close to 1.5 miles in Iraq. So they're very powerful guns. I mean, we don't have any shooting ranges in Rhode Island that are 1.5 miles long. I mean, why would a civilian need to have a gun like that? I think people are waking up to the fact that those kinds of things are on the market and are available to 18-year-olds and even 21-year-olds. I mean, the people just feel like they shouldn't be available for sale in Rhode Island.
maybe the most talked about proposal the president put forward this week, and very strong reactions, was the idea of arming teachers, having more teachers be trained and armed to potentially deal with an active shooter situation like we saw in Parkland last week. Frank, your reaction to that idea?
It would depend on the teacher. If it's a requirement, I wouldn't be on board with it. But there are some states, some southern states, that actually are encouraging teachers to be able to be trained and actually could possess firearms on school grounds. I would think it would be more, we'd probably be better served to have a police officer in each one of the schools in Rhode Island instead of having teachers do that. So, but I'm still on the fence on that. I'm not sure of how that would go out, but they've had some really good results in southern states where teachers were armed.
Linda, I'm sure a very different view is based on, we're seeing some teachers come out and say they don't want this. What's your group's view?
Well, I think if you look at what happened in Parkland, that there was an armed security guard at the school that didn't actually go into the school when the shooting started. He waited outside and never actually went in and approached the shooter. You know, I mean, I think that a teacher wants to carry a gun on them, and if you have a concealed carry permit, you have to have it on your person all the time, and has a classroom of children, and that they're going to pull a gun out and shoot somebody. I mean, it's just absurd that teachers would be in that position, and they would want to be in that position with their children and with their students. You know, we don't want our schools to turn into prisons where we're having metal detectors and, you know, police presence in all the schools and teachers that are armed. I mean, that is just so counterproductive to children learning and being in a free and open environment, and having and we know that people that carry guns tend to be more aggressive in their interactions with people because they have a gun. And to think that a teacher is carrying a gun, and in Rhode Island right now, teachers can carry on school property, and the principals and the administration doesn't know who these teachers are. A janitor can carry a gun, a teacher can carry a gun, a parent can carry a gun on school property right now, and that's one of the pieces of legislation that we've been trying to change with support from all the teachers' organizations and with teachers themselves.
Frank, your response?
The NRA did a study in 2012 after the Sandy Hook shooting and said that our schools really are not really well equipped to handle any type of shooter that would come on the property. And they said that our schools are lacking in security, and in fact, we're putting our children at risk. The piece of legislation that Linda Finn and her group is trying to put forward, it's our opinion that is the worst piece of legislation you could put forward in Rhode Island.
This is, I believe, the safe zone.
Safe
you can't have a gun on the school property.
If you look back at the last 50 years, everyone except for maybe 2 or 3 mass shootings has happened in a gun-free zone. What she's trying to do is make sure that in Rhode Island, we have a gun-free zone in our K through 12 schools. That's incredible. Every parent that has a child in a K through 12 school right now should be absolutely furious that they're trying to do this and put back the same type of failed security system that was in Sandy Hook, same type of failed security system that was in the Pulse nightclub, same type of failed security system in Pensacola, Florida, in our schools in Rhode Island. We need real security in our schools. We need something that if somebody came forward with a firearm, was going to intend to try to do harm, they would meet some resistance. Linda Finn wants to put a big sign outside that says, "Don't worry, there are no guns in here."
Before I will let Linda respond, but what would you cite for folks who aren't sure about this idea as the best example of a time where allowing a gun in a school, for example, prevented what could have been a tragedy like what we saw in Parkland?
Okay, I didn't have any examples to bring forward today.
There are none.
Okay. There are examples, and if you would ask me to bring some, I do have actually examples that we have when we go up to State House, excuse me, to actually show that people were actually concealed carry holders, were in an area and were able to stop shooters and able to minimize the damage that happened because there was someone that could respond with the appropriate amount of force when someone came in and was trying to do harm. For Linda Finn to sit here and say there are none, that's just incredible.
Well, I think that, you know, what I'd like to just say is that you know, I think that law enforcement has a pretty good idea of what the best type of security schools should have. And I was at a meeting just the other night with a police officer from Bristol who explained that they had just gone through a training that the police do. It's the 3rd training that they've done this year. They do at least a minimum of 3 trainings in school situations to, you know, how would they respond and what they would do. And, you know, and he said in these situations, I mean, a lot of times these kids, they'll throw a smoke bomb or they'll, you know, pull a fire alarm. And so it's so chaotic in a situation like that. And that even for a trained police officer who goes through constant training on firearms and on these types of situations, to think that an individual that has a concealed carry permit that doesn't have any of that training is going to be successful in trying to fend off some kid that comes in with an AR-15. Our opinion is that let's get rid of the AR-15s. Let's get rid of the AR-15s.
We have to go to a break in about a minute, Frank. So final question to you. Obviously, everyone wants to prevent another Parkland. You oppose the legislation that is being proposed. Any ideas on how to address the mass shootings and gun violence that we're seeing today?
Let's focus on the real problem. There is a real security issue that we have in our schools and around the country. We have to address that. You don't want to trample on people's Second Amendment rights and just say, law-abiding citizens, turn in your firearms and everything will be better. That doesn't work.
All right, Frank Sacoccio is the president of the Rhode Island Second Amendment Coalition, and Linda Finn is president of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. When we come back, John Marion from Common Cause and Stephen Brown from the ACLU of Rhode Island. We're going to be talking about the thorny topic of expelling a lawmaker next on Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. To my left, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi. Our guests on the second half, John Marion, Executive Director of Common Cause Rhode Island, and Steve Brown. He's the Executive Director of the ACLU of Rhode Island. John, we'll start with you. Senator Nick Kettle resigned on Thursday, sparing the Senate from having to go through the process of expulsion, which is probably good because it sounds like there isn't one. So how does the state constitution address evicting a lawmaker right now?
Sure. So for people who aren't familiar, Rhode Island didn't have a constitution until the 1840s, a written one. Beginning in the 1840s, there's been a clause in the Constitution that gives the House and the Senate the power to punish and or expel a member with a 2/3 vote. It doesn't say if it's a 2/3 vote of members present or 2/3 vote of all members. So there's even ambiguity in there about how many need to vote on it. So it's a broad right. It doesn't have a very extensive standard for what must be found to punish or expel the member.
And we don't have any experience in this area.
No, so the reporting has been that the state librarian concludes that it's never happened. There's never been an expulsion.
So Steve, the ACLU of Rhode Island sent a letter to the Senate President asking to pump the brakes, if you will, on the expulsion of Kettle. Why did you do that?
Well, we were very concerned that this was speeding along without any process in place. You know, as John mentioned, the Constitution itself really doesn't set any standards at all. It doesn't set the standards for what are grounds for expulsion. It doesn't set any standards on how you proceed with deciding whether to expel somebody. And this was just going way too fast without any precedent to guide how to proceed. We were very concerned. You know, the indictment against Senator Kettle came up on February 16th. The resolution of expulsion came up on February 21st, and they were scheduled to actually vote on it February 27th, less than a week later.
In committee?
In committee, yes. And, you know, without any guidelines, standards as to how this was actually going to work, we were deeply concerned that there was too much of a rush here on such a consequential issue. And I think it's important to emphasize how consequential it is. First, in terms of setting a precedent for the future, how you're going to deal with senatorial conduct and when you're going to expel somebody, but also the consequences for Senator Kettle's district. You know, they were talking about expelling somebody who had been elected by the voters in 4 elections and actually disenfranchising that entire district for a full session. That's very significant.
Steve, the pushback you heard from senators was, look, this was a unique case because Senator Kettle was indicted for allegedly extorting sex from a teenage Senate page. There's a power dynamic there, and especially in the wake of the last year's headlines about sexual conduct in the workplace. And they said you couldn't have him around the Senate with those kind of accusations there. What do you say to that argument?
Well, first of all, every situation is going to be unique. You're always going to be pointing to, well, this is different for whatever reason. But it is important to keep in mind, first, these are allegations. Secondly, we're not quite sure what happened. If you read the indictment, it's not even clear whether actual sexual conduct took place. He used verbal communications to threaten somebody. Now, neither of these is a good thing, but to not even know exactly what happened and to use that as the basis for expelling somebody is troubling. And of course, these allegations date back 7 years. So I certainly understand the interest in protecting pages from inappropriate conduct, but if you look at the entire situation, I'm not quite sure where that need for rushing comes in.
But it's important to know, though, that, and I've heard some people say, well, he was, innocent until proven guilty. Mm-hmm. The Senate is not a court of law, and no senator facing any sort of expulsion or punishment is afforded the same rights as somebody in a criminal case. So there should be process, but it doesn't. You don't have to be convicted in a criminal court to be expelled. The Senate can make a decision about your behavior independent of what the court.
Well, it sounds like the Constitution says just whatever 2/3 of senators think is worth expelling is grounds for expulsion.
Yeah, period. I mean, and there's no case law in Rhode Island, so that part of the Constitution has never been tested.
All right, but so, John, the Senate President and the Senate Minority Leader, they didn't put Nick Kettle into office, the people did. Mm-hmm. So there's the argument that the people should take him out of office. Why not a recall election for a system in Rhode Island?
Well, so we don't have recall for this. You can recall statewide office holders. I think the main argument I'd put against recall is they face election every 2 years. By the time something comes up, there's almost another election. But and recalls lead to sometimes constant elections. They're sometimes used in political purposes, for political reasons, where and you end up with no finality. Elections are about finality. You choose somebody, they're in office until the next election. So I'm not sure recall is the right solution.
Unfortunately, Steve, this is not the first lawmaker to potentially get in trouble in Rhode Island, and perhaps won't be the last. Do you have any thoughts on what the House and Senate should do to, since this is still in the Constitution and could still be used in the future, to have a more robust process if they again think there might be a reason to expel a lawmaker?
Yeah, I hope this is a wake-up call that the House and the Senate will actually give some thought now. What should the procedures be? Should something like this crop up again? Should we need to consider whether to expel somebody? At this point, I'm not in a position to say these are what the procedures should be. But we need time to think about it. I mean, that was one of our points in our letter to the Senate President. Let's figure out what the procedure should be, as opposed to going through the expulsion and then sort of making it up as we go along. So I'm hopeful that people will think about it. We did have many years ago an impeachment proceeding with Chief Judge Bevilacqua many years ago, and there was a very detailed process that the House Judiciary Committee came up with that would be an example to look at. But have something in place. Let everybody know how the process is going to work, what are the standards that are going to be used, instead of just saying, okay, this person's been indicted, let's start an expulsion procedure.
John, to put you on the spot, are there other states that do it well, or that we could look to?
Yeah, in fact, this is not, it's never happened in Rhode Island, but it sure has happened in other states. And this month, Arizona expelled a lawmaker without a criminal conviction because of fear of his presence in the building. But they only did it after a lengthy debate, hearing, and issuing a report by a committee that did an investigation. It seems that in most cases when this is done, there's some sort of investigation by the body itself. They issue a report. The person who's been accused of things has a right to rebut that report.
So it sounds like turning expulsion, you both think, closer into what we think of as impeachment, the way the impeachment process works federally and has worked in Rhode Island.
Yeah, and Steve's right that there is a model for this. I mean, it goes back to 1986. But we certainly, could learn from that as well as from other states.
Can I ask you briefly, Steve, on a different topic? We don't have much time left, but the case of Lillian Calderon, the Rhode Island woman who was detained by ICE. She's now out, but there is certainly, it seems like, a lot of uncertainty around her situation and where things stand. Can you just briefly summarize what you've been very involved where that stands right now?
Sure. She's out for 90 days. ICE agreed to let her out for 90 days. As a result of the lawsuit that we filed, and that a private attorney has been working on her behalf as well. But after 90 days, they could do the same thing they did in January and arrest her. Fortunately, the federal judge who's hearing our case is very concerned about how ICE acted in this. He's seen this happen more than once, where they detain somebody under very strange circumstances, somebody who's no threat at all, and then they let her out, they let the person out once litigation takes place. So you're having people, if they're lucky enough to have an attorney, be able to get out. And if you don't, they may be stuck there.
Steve Brown from the ACLU of Rhode Island, John Marion from Common Cause of Rhode Island, thank you very much for joining us. If you missed any of the show, including a gun control debate in the first half, it's on WPRI.com. For Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.